Good evening. Friends, we gather on the land of the Yagara and the Turrbal people, the traditional custodians of this land, and we pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. It's my pleasure to welcome you here this evening. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Janice McGrandle and I am the Director of the Cooperative, and this is our second Albert Street Lecture, a new series where we hope to create space for dialogue for a public theology in the uniting church in Queensland. So it's so wonderful to be here in this historic church building, the Albert Street Church. It's a lovely evening, and welcome also to those of us who are joining us online. For this evening, we will have a lecture, and that will be followed by a response by the Rev Dr. David Pittman, who will respond to the paper, and then we'll have some time for some open discussion. So that's how the evening will flow. But first, let me introduce you to our guest lecturer this evening. The Rev Dr. Linda Hamill is serving as the minister at St Stephen's Toowoomba Uniting Church. She holds a Bachelor of Theology, a Master's in Theological Studies and a Doctorate in Ministry. She is the chairperson of the Uniting Church in Australia's Queensland Synod Disaster Response and Community Recovery Committee, and her experience in disaster recovery ministry in Australia began after the Gap storm in 2008. She served as minister in Maranoa during the 100-year floods and responded in ministry to Goodna during the Brisbane floods. She is also a disaster recovery chaplain trainer and an expert in disaster-related homiletics. Her doctoral thesis, titled Silencing the Preacher, the Use of Silence During Post-Disaster Sermons. It is my deep pleasure to introduce her to you this evening, presenting her paper, It's a Disaster, Insights into Ministry After a Disaster. Friends, the Rev Dr. Linda Hamill.
Thank you. It is truly a privilege to be invited to speak to you this evening and to be invited into the Center for Public Theology. Public theology, as I understand, is the gathering of the publican, the shopkeeper, the accountant, homeless, maybe the police officer, and the theologian to discuss theology. And one significant venue that happens on a regular basis, where these discussions happen on a regular basis, is in an evacuation center or in a disaster recovery center. When I attended the introduction to the cooperative here, Reverend Dr. Peter Hobson in his introduction said that Australians are not comfortable taking up public discourse of theology, and I paraphrase his speech at the opening night. But this is evident in the venues following disaster. I suggest that most people, including Christians, are ill-prepared to take up the very public theological topics which dominate the conversation after a significant disaster. So I have two goals for you tonight. I desire to give you tools and thoughts which will be useful in your wrestling with God regarding disasters, so that you can develop your own theological framework to use in the public theological conversation. And secondly, I'd like to give you practical advice regarding disaster recovery, and that comes from my years of research and practice in my own disaster recovery ministry. So as a bit of a background, it's helpful to know what actually is a disaster. Now, I might say the phrase, it's a disaster, quite regularly, but that is not necessarily the definition of a disaster. In Australia, the official definition comes from Emergency Management Australia. And being a government body, the definition is rather long and unhelpful. So I'm going to read you the definition from the Brisbane City Disaster Management Plan. And their definition here in Brisbane of a disaster is this: a serious disruption in a community caused by the impact of an event that requires a significant coordinated response by state government and other entities to help the community to recover from the disruption. And serious disruption means loss of human life or illness or injury to humans, widespread or severe property loss or damage, or widespread and severe damage to the environment. The Red Cross thankfully summarizes that long definition. And the Red Cross definition of a disaster is this: a situation that causes human suffering or creates human needs that the affected people cannot alleviate without assistance. A situation that causes human suffering or needs that the affected people cannot alleviate without assistance. It's a disaster. In a small community, a fatal car accident may be a disaster if people need assistance to recover. It's also important for you to know in a disaster who are the affected people by that disaster. Obviously, the people in the community are affected, all to different degrees. But people who enter into a community, the first responders, the service providers, the mud army, once they enter that community, they are also disaster-affected people, again, to different degrees. Family and friends of the people in the community are also disaster-affected. If you know someone who's been in a disaster, you become a disaster-affected person. And then there's also the people who watch the disaster on television. They are and become disaster affected just simply by watching the scenes over and over again. So basically, in a disaster, we're all affected, perhaps to different degrees. And even family who are far away, their sense of order is often thrown into chaos because of the disaster that you're experiencing. So what happens when we say it's a disaster? Well, we start by taking a deep breath. There is order. It might look like chaos, but there is order. God is good. The state and local governments have very well planned and practiced response. I actually ate dinner with a local government person last night who was talking about their disaster exercise. So they practice, and there is order. They have a plan. The police are in charge in a disaster to keep the order. The fire department and the state emergency services are responsible for keeping people safe. And it's very easy for you to familiarize yourself with the disaster plans because they are online on your council website. In the immediate chaos, the decisions that the authorities might make often don't make sense because the circumstances surrounding the disaster are often very complex, and unless we know all the angles, we won't understand why the decisions were made. So disasters actually require that we humble ourselves to the authorities to keep ourselves and others safe. And if you enter into a disaster area, you do require training. It's very important that you're properly prepared to enter into a disaster area. Alongside that ordered response by local and state government, there is a clear pattern of events and moods in the community following a disaster. Now, if you put on my first slide, please. I don't expect you to read the slide, but you can follow the mood. And the amount of time that slide is about 12, the line is 12 months, and out to 5 years. You see, it takes 5 years on average for a community to recover from a disaster. Now you see that early on the top of the chart, the mood is very high. This is the heroic or the honeymoon stage. It's a time of altruism and community unity. You hear these phrases, "We'll get through this. We're Australians. We've done this before." And in these immediate days following the disaster, local government will call in outside agencies and service providers who already have agreements in place to help. So if you want to respond early on, the best place to help is to train and be a volunteer for an agency that has an agreement to enter in to the disaster area. Now, we'll need to focus a little bit more on the next slide, which is the bottom, the need. This is the need. And if you were paying attention on the first slide, you'll see it's exact opposite of the mood. After that high period of heroic and honeymoon stage, we slide into disillusionment. And that goes well into construction, and it's a very slow and gradual climb out over the next 5 years, really. Aid agencies pull out of a community in about 3 weeks, and people who are left in the community begin to take stock. The dust is cleared, and they find out that the task of recovery is actually huge. It's huge. And the community becomes disillusioned, and the need in the community goes up. And you see that on this slide. The need is peaked there, and the need as the community recovers then tapers off. Volunteering drops in a community during this time. People can only pay attention to their own and their own family's immediate needs. Vulnerable groups during this time become more vulnerable, and this is the time all people need to worry about self-care. And this stage of disillusionment occurs about 6 months following to 12 months following the disaster. It's the time when all the help is gone in the community, so this is a great time for you to help the most. 12 months later, to contact the local church in that disaster area and offer your help. We tend to offer our help at the beginning when the needs are less. So, and this, a year or two after the disaster is when the needs are highest. But during all these moods or stages following a disaster, the entire community becomes a venue for public theology. And there are 2 major theological themes presenting in a disaster-affected community. And you might guess the first. The first is Theodicy, that question of why. Why did this happen? Why would God do this? Where is God? And the second theological topic discussed, and this might surprise you, is theophany, that sudden discovery or experience of God. So we'll begin with Theodicy, that question of how could God let this happen? Those questions stem from an individual's perception of what God's justice looks like. Individuals wrestle with these questions in relationship to their belief in God. And theodicy really is that wrestling with God. When we think of theodicy, we think of Job. Job challenged God with similar questions. Job insisted that nature, or rather creation, was not just, and Job demanded answers. Job believes that creation is not playing the game according to Job's understanding of the rules. He asserts that creation is not ordered in a godly way so as to protect the righteous. And Job is struggling to understand God. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind in chapter 38. From the storm, God replies, and I'll paraphrase God's reply. God says, "I'm too big for you to comprehend, but there are boundaries even to the storm." You see, God created a dynamic world which is grand and complex in design, and not just in size, but the complexities. And this means that the world that God created is not and cannot be risk-free or safe for human beings. A point in case would be wild animals protecting their offspring. They might be looking for a feed, or and these wild animals can indeed hurt or even kill human beings. And I speak personally, I have experienced a magpie attack. They are not safe. Humanity is interconnected with creation and is thus subject to creation's occasional eruptions and fierce strength. And we experience even violence at the hand of creation. Humanity's sin, greed, and brokenness, of course, can contribute to the consequences of the boundaries of nature. And both human beings and nature have the capacity to cause great harm. And Job has to learn to live with that tension. God's answer to Job out of the whirlwind not only silences Job, but brings Job to a greater understanding of his insignificance in God's grand creation. The whirlwind not only displays the power of God of created order, which is dangerous to human beings and to Job, but it also demonstrates that God is in the storm, and that God's boundaries apply even to the storm. God thereby depicts creation as both good and wild, both ordered and disorderly. Understanding the disaster belongs to God and does not necessarily stop people from wrestling with the questions. That's okay. Job was allowed a long period of time to wrestle, all the way up to chapter 38. He was allowed to wrestle, to dialogue with his friends before God finally answers. Immediately following a disaster, people are in shock and are looking to meet their immediate needs of safety and survival. Often the theological question, why, doesn't come for them until much later in the recovery process, often in that disillusionment stage when their needs are higher. And it may not even arise at all. Early on during recovery, these questions of theodicy most often come from the responders, because they're coming into the disaster from an outside situation which is normal, which is not chaos. They haven't lived through the disaster. And they are struggling with the dissonance, trying to explain why their lives can be so normal and why these particular people can be so impacted. They struggle with knowing their ordered life is nothing like the destruction they see before them, and they begin to wrestle to explain those dissonances. And so it's important during our initial response to a disaster for the pastoral care or the preacher or the theologian not to move too quickly to discuss theodicy. People must be allowed to approach the question in their own time frame and in their own manner. And it's very important that we don't introduce our own personal theology and philosophies, because early on, when people are in shock, that's too much information. And the additional information is generally more than a disaster person can cope with. So early on in a disaster, you're not necessarily going to encounter a person having a crisis of faith. On the contrary, you're more likely to find people who've had an experience, a theophany of God. So as Christian responders or people who are working in a disaster, it's not our job to answer their questions of theodicy. And that may sound wrong, but hear me out. We're not responsible for answering people's questions on behalf of God. We must let them do their own wrestling the same as we must do our wrestling. We must respect that their exploration of the theological question is personal and that people deserve the time and space to work it through themselves. The work of answering the questions of theodicy is literally a person's wrestling with God. So I want you to imagine for just a moment that night that Jacob wrestled with God in Genesis chapter 32. Imagine his hard work, his exhaustion, and then the blessing that came through his wrestling. Jacob was renewed. His name was changed. His life was transformed in that wrestling. Now, as you imagine Jacob wrestling with God that night, imagine someone interrupting his wrestling and saying, "I've got the answers for you." Don't do it. Don't offer answers. Don't offer your beliefs or platitudes. You can go to the next slide. Do you remember Job's friends? They were unhelpful. They were offering their pat theological answers, and not only were they unhelpful, they were wrong. When God speaks, you learn that there is freedom in all of creation to behave as God created. And some of God's creation was simply created dangerous to human beings. So saying anything about God's plan or that God is going to take care of this is not only unhelpful, it could be wrong. God is sovereign, but human beings and creation are still dangerous. So then, what do we do? Well, back to Jacob and his wrestling, while it was personal, and he had to do the work that changed him from being the trickster to the patriarch. And it seems like maybe to us that he did that work alone. But you know what? He had a community around him. He had a huge community, in fact, an entourage, and a brother who was actually in the end happy to see him. And in the moment, Jacob was alone, but not in the big picture. Our work as carers is to journey with people as they explore their spiritual questions, to be present. We are to walk with them on their journey and not do their battles with them. Our task is to provide a safe place for public theology. Our job is to listen and to reflect back what we hear, allowing people to answer their own questions. As I mentioned earlier, the discourse that happens most frequently early on in a disaster is theophany. It's extremely common for people of all levels and types of faith experiences to come to experience God during the disaster. As they narrate the events that they experienced in a disaster, they express gratitude to God or to a higher power for the miracles that they perceived, for these experiences that they believed could never have happened, or these other events that unfolded in surprisingly helpful ways. The water stopped just at the door sill, and these people credit those experiences to God. There are stories of people receiving help in just the nick of time, or rescuers appearing out of nowhere. All these stories are credited as God being there. There are reports of God-given courage or God-given peace. And these experiences are expressed in terms of God revealing God's self during the disaster. These sudden and surprising revelatory experiences of God are theophany. God revealing God's self during the disaster to the people. And boy, oh boy, are people ready to tell you these stories. They are so excited to share their experience of God. And they, in their excitement, will share the story over and over again, what God has done for them. And you will get the opportunity to hear the narration more than once. Remember, the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind. Well, it wasn't really a whirlwind. It was not a slight breeze, but it was a tempest, a big storm. God revealed God's self to Job through the very event that we might identify as a natural disaster. God chose to answer Job through the event which Job complained of. Job accused God and said, "You lift me on the wind and you make me ride on it and you toss me about in the roar of the storm." God does not only give the answers to Job out of the whirlwind, but God gives God's self. And just like Job experienced God in the storm, people in disaster-affected areas will experience God revealed in the disaster. In amazing and mysterious ways, people will encounter God and hear God's word and be comforted. And this also is the time to listen. You cannot correct or offer your explanation of the event, but you need to be in relationship with people as they wrestle to understand their experience of God. These same people eventually fall into disillusionment about 6 months on. And at that time, when they're most disillusioned, you can ask them again to retell the story of their experience of God. So, post-disaster, you are likely to encounter Theodicy, people who are trying to come to grips with the dissonance between their belief in God and their lived experience. Also, it's very likely that you will hear amazing stories of theophany, stories about people's encounter with God in miraculous ways. So these are the two theologies very present in the aftermath of a disaster, and they walk side by side. Any observer will be struck by the manner that both theologies are present. It will feel to you as if one of them is out of place. When encountering someone's theophany, If you've been experiencing theodicy, you're going to feel like maybe you're doing something wrong. And vice versa. If you are experiencing a theophany, you've experienced God, and you hear someone's stories and questioning God, you're going to say, wow, did I get it wrong? Both of these theological ideas are in public dialogue, and they're in tension with each other. So if we're going to walk or sit or journey with a disaster-affected person, or if we're going to provide a safe place for public theology for people who are on these deeply spiritual journeys, then we need to prepare ourselves for that journey. It's very important that we've worked through these questions and these experiences in our own lives and have a foundation that we're happy with and solid with. Otherwise, we can be damaged by entering into the disaster space and hearing other people's wrestling. So I'd like to give you now some information or tools that may help you do your work. And one technique or tool that's been suggested as a way to hold the tension between theodicy and theophany is tragic vision. Yeah, tragic vision, a literary style found in Shakespeare's tragedies. And so that you know what tragic vision is, I made sure I had a definition for that as well. According to the University of New York, in the literary genre of tragedy, there seems to be a mix of 7 interrelated elements that we call tragic vision. And they are these 7 sort of interrelated ideas. The conclusion is catastrophic in a tragedy. The catastrophic conclusion will seem inevitable. It occurs ultimately because of human limitations of the protagonist, and the protagonist suffers terribly. The protagonist's suffering often seems disproportionate to his or her culpability. Yet, the suffering is usually redemptive, bringing out the noblest of human capacities for learning. The suffering is also redemptive in bringing out the capacity for accepting moral responsibility. Theologian Matthew Johnson, in his book entitled The Tragic Vision of African American Religion, calls tragic vision a creative response to the human encounter with the abyss. Beverly Wallace, Associate Professor of Congregational and Community Care at Luther Seminary, suggests that by embracing ambiguity with tragic vision, it leads us to tragic wisdom. She also suggests that a spirit-manifested care infused with creative imagination will enable the church to assist God's people to live through a disaster. We need to learn and understand tragic vision. We can do that already from the experiences we have. Consider the events that we remember every Easter. Good Friday, a tragic death on a cross, a grief-filled, somber Saturday morning. We are approaching the abyss. Tragic vision is that encounter with non-being, the threat of meaninglessness. Yet, tragic vision is life-affirming. Then early on the next morning, we hear the sound of the women proclaim, "He is risen!" And we clearly see the wonder of God and begin to understand our own reliance on God. We might even be able to sing with Bob Marley. Every little thing's gonna be all right. I don't know, maybe. As public theologians, we are called to help people acknowledge the tragic vision, their grief, and understanding that something has been lost, and help them acknowledge the psychological pain of loss. Then we help them in understanding their new environment. We help them investigate new relationships and develop that new sense of identity that comes with an Easter Sunday morning. During this pandemic which we're in, we have probably never before faced life with as much ambiguity as we have now. Tragic vision calls us to live with ambiguity, to embrace tolerance, to have creative spirituality, ritual, and sacred spaces in which to encounter the holy mystery of God. We're called to be a place of public theology. This ambiguity in the pandemic which we face calls us to enter the empty tomb, to weep, to wrestle, to question, and to experience the risen Christ. That looks like theodicy and theophany. It looks like public theology to me. So, in my own personal wrestling with God, and I have done quite a bit, I have decided that God is God, and I simply don't understand. I believe there is a created order, which I don't understand, and I am okay with that, because I also have God's promise. God promised renewal. Over and over again in the Old Testament, the people were forgiven and redeemed by God. God demonstrates great love for humankind and to me. God demonstrated that God was willing to suffer with me through the incarnate Son, Jesus, but God also demonstrated the ultimate renewal in the resurrection. So your role in ministry during a disaster is to point to hope. That's all. And we can only do that in the complexity of relationship. Now, I know I don't have to tell you that relationships are complex, and then add to that the chaos of disaster. But I will tell you to hold on to your experiences of theodicy and theophany, and hold in tension the two. Think in terms of tragic vision. Now, you're probably thinking or asking, so if I'm going to enter this space of public theology, and I'm not going to enter into the wrestling match, what do I actually do? What can I do? And that's a question of capability. What can you do? What do you have the capacity to do? And there are heaps of practical things that you can do. But do them according to your skills, your gifts, and your talents. Don't do things that you're naturally not good at. And in your doing, act in a manner that is renewing, in a way that gives hope. And it may be as simple as letting them see you smile. You're in a disaster setting. People you are responding to were present during the disaster. They survived the event and have suffered loss, perhaps even the loss of the life of a loved one. Sit silently with them. God was in the storm. Now is the time that God is in the quiet. God is in the silence, in the still, small voice. Not the voice that says, she'll be right, mate, but the voice that says, you're hurting, and I'm here. And in time, they will tell you what they need. And they be the simple thing, can you get me? Can you help me find? I need to go. And again, thinking of your capacity, maybe it's not something that you can do for them, but you can find the person that can help them. Don't counsel, refer to trained counselors. Respond appropriately first to their human needs, food, water, security. Emotion during this time will have overtaken logic. People will be in shock. They will say that they're okay, and they may not be. And this includes ministers in a disaster area. They are tired and often have tunnel vision. That's what happens when you're disillusioned. You can only see the tasks ahead of you. And it's very common for people in that downhill slide of disillusionment to neglect self because they just keep moving from task to task. People will tell you they're fine, but eyes in your ears will tell you another story, and you will see and hear their stress. So follow your senses and help people get rest. Remember, recovery takes 5 years, and it's a bit of a marathon. So help people know it's okay that if the task doesn't happen right now, that they have time, and in the grand scheme of things, they probably aren't losing much. That they will work more efficiently if they take a break. Offer people the opportunity to sit and to take up the discourse. Invite them into conversation. Ask them to explain what they did and why they did it. Asking those kind of specific questions help them get out of the emotional brain and into the logical brain. Ask them to explain their plan for recovery. And emotional people who are tired, it might take them a long time to answer that question, but keep prompting them to ask them for their plan. The second thing you really need to be aware of in the disaster setting is power. People who've lost everything are vulnerable. They step back down Maslow's hierarchy of need, and they're in shock, and they can't really think. So again, offer them food and water, their basic needs, but then find out other things, the random things. Do you feel secure? Why don't you feel secure? Do you have your medication? Approach each person as an individual, as a valuable human being, a person, and accept humbly that you don't know what they're going to need or what they're going to say. And so use your observations and ask wondering questions. I wonder if you need a special diet. I wonder if you have a place to take a break. Empower people to make decisions for themselves. Don't act like the mud army and just toss everything out because it's muddy. Give people respect and information. Let them make their decisions. And they may make illogical decisions. That's okay. Let them hang on to the random things for now. They're emotional, not logical. So do not use your power to persuade inappropriately. Occasionally, people will ask you why you're doing this, and you can tell them about your God and how your God calls you to respond. But don't evangelize or proselytize. It's not the time to make disciples. God will make disciples if you faithfully bring hope. The seeds of God's love will be planted, and they will seek God in the right season. It's an abuse of power to tell people to repent and be saved. And I've seen that happen in disasters. The disaster space is complex, and people are vulnerable. Don't abuse it. Don't operate outside your expertise. Refer. And don't go it alone. You need someone to debrief to. You need someone to unload to. And the most important thing for you to do is make sure you rest. Each and every one of you, make sure that you have time for God in the silence. Cry. And if you need to be, you do need to be of fresh mind and fresh spirit in order to help. So self-care is paramount in a disaster. So a reminder that most resources are committed early on in the disaster. In that few weeks, the need is low. So if you really want to help out in a disaster, contact them 12 months on and find out what they need. Go out and do a door knock, give everybody a plant, do a welfare check at the same time, listening to determine what is the community really needing at this time, because 12 to 24 months is when the needs are the highest. It's very easy for us to jump immediately to respond to the chaos. Renewal is the goal, and it's not just a spiritual word. The recovery teams talk about renewal. Rebuilding doesn't mean that everything is going to be back the way it was, but it will be new. And people will grieve. And so it's important that your ministry give hope. And sort of finishing up here, don't send stuff. Don't send stuff into a disaster location. People don't often have homes to put stuff in. Local economies need them to spend their money locally, and sending stuff hampers that. Sell your stuff and send the money. And, or better yet, hold it until they're disillusioned. Then you can contribute as you know, the funds and really have an impact and make a difference. You don't need to go immediately into a disaster to make a significant difference, to bring hope. And your goal is to bring hope. And if you're serious about disaster recovery ministry, then you need to be prepared for the task. Know your gifts, volunteer with an agency, or wait a year and respond to a disillusioned community. And most of all, know the theological questions and be prepared to enter the venue called public theology in a disaster. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. We're very delighted to have Reverend Dr. David Pittman here to offer a response. For those of you who do not know him, David Pittman is a practical theologian, twice moderator of the Uniting Church in the Queensland Synod, and a former principal of Trinity College, Queensland. I'm also he's certainly done many roles, but I'm mindful in this building, a former superintendent minister of the Albert Street Church and Wesley Mission, Queensland. So we're delighted, David, that you could be here this evening to offer a response to Linda's paper. Thank you.
Linda, as I said to you earlier, having spent almost all of today reading and rereading and reflecting on your paper, and very grateful for the opportunity to do so, I found it enthralling, and I want to thank you personally very much for it, because it speaks to us all in our current social and ecclesial and political context, and it offers constructive and challenging insight and guidance from your own personal experience and ministry, and I think that makes it even more powerful. As I said to you, I think this is crying out for at least a one-day seminar, and I'd be the first to enrol if you decide to do it. Now, as it happens, I've been reflecting yesterday and today on the readings from With Love to the World, which are based on James chapter 2, one of the readings set for this coming Sunday. Reflections written by the Reverend Dr. Chris Gorringe, who is our Uniting Church minister at Roseville in Sydney. Now, Chris explores the relationship between faith and action, a relationship that has particular importance, it seems to me, in the context of disaster and the grief and loss that accompanies it. You speak in your paper, Linda, about the critical importance of congregations being faithful to their calling to be God's people in their communities, responding and caring without discrimination. We recognise with sadness that this is in stark contrast to the hope engendered by political promises that are never realised, and the seemingly endless efforts of financial institutions to avoid their obligations. Now, as I read, my mind went to the mine disaster at Beaconsfield in Tasmania in 2006, and the long and incredibly difficult process of rescuing the 2 miners who were still alive deep underground. Francis Seen, the Uniting Church community minister in Beaconsfield, offered quite extraordinary ministry during that time and beyond it. And Francis epitomised several of the key qualities about which you speak in your paper. Firstly, she understood her limitations and she functioned superbly within them. Secondly, she nurtured an environment of compassion and support that was made freely available to anyone who sought it and from which no one was excluded. And thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, when the politicians, the press, the union reps and the mining officials were all gone, Francis and her congregation were still there, committed to the community and journeying with it. Now, this is what Eugene Peterson described, I think, as a long obedience in the same direction. And I believe that understanding what that means for the church in our own time is absolutely critical. Our experience over the past 18 months has challenged many of our long-held, often cherished assumptions about what it means to be church. We've had to respond to significant limitations on when and how we can gather in community, and even what we can do when we're together. We sit apart and we wear masks. We're only just beginning to grapple with what it means to be church in a time of COVID. We may soon come to the realisation that we have no option but to revision our future altogether. A radical, frightening, exciting possibility. Linda, I also found your reflections on language really helpful. And I understand that many people struggle to know what to say in situations of crisis or grief or pain, not realising that the most helpful response is to say very little and to avoid platitudes and giving advice. Many of our people need more help with this aspect of both their personal and pastoral relationships. Your exploration of the language of theodicy and theophany and the experience of tragic vision, I think, are particularly important for us. I think they represent really, really good public theology. We've experienced a series of disasters in the Australian context in recent years: cyclones, floods, droughts, and catastrophic bushfires. A repetition of one or more of these calamities in the context of the COVID pandemic will stretch our personal and natural resources to the absolute limit. Are we ready for such a challenge? Is the church ready for such a challenge? I'd be very much interested in your response to that question, Linda. And I think it would be helpful in this Uniting Church context to learn more about the Synod Committee that you chair and the work it undertakes. If there's time, you might like to say a bit more about that tonight. So thank you again. You've given us much to reflect on and learn from tonight, and I think all of us are very grateful.
Thank you, David. I appreciate your words. Are we prepared as a church for a disaster happening within the pandemic disaster? My answer is maybe. Parts of the church, perhaps. During this last 12 months, Peter Armstrong with Lifeline and I have been working around the state building community resilience in particular communities and training communities to understand what happens in the event of a disaster and be ready. So I think we are more prepared than we were. The Synod Disaster Committee, Community Recovery and Disaster Response Committee is not as effective as it could be because I think people don't know about us and they don't know what we do or and how to respond to the work that we do. People tend to wait to the last minute and there's a disaster and then now what do we do? And we can be better prepared. And the work of that committee is to try to help presbyteries and congregations to be better prepared. We are also seeking, continuing to seek funding to do more community training and to work together with local ministers to help them to be able to have more capacity within their communities to do that long work, that marathon work of recovery. And so I think we're getting there. I think we're understanding more and more that disasters don't just go away, they'll continue to happen, and that we actually, while we can say, yeah, we've done this before, that maybe we're getting tired now and we need to do something differently. And that's what I hoped for this evening, is to give you some fodder and some discussion about what public theology and what really is happening in a community after disaster.
We would love to open up for some questions, and I'll put my mask back on and I'll be roaming around with this microphone. So anyone can ask a question, and Linda, if you're happy to just stay here and field the questions as they come.
Thank you so much, Linda. That was an amazing address, and what a wonderful occasion, our second lecture to have such great content. The graph that you had up really intrigued me, and I'm assuming that the graph, and just my assumption, that's taken as a community response.
Yes.
A number of disasters where I've been in ministry, bushfires in the Blue Mountains, floods in Ipswich, and even now, the COVID pandemic, what has struck me is that individually, people can be at very different spaces. So in the Blue Mountains, one house is completely burned to the ground, and across the road, the other house is untouched. In Ipswich, we had one side of the road underwater, the other side of the road just because of the landscape wasn't. And even in this pandemic, different households have experienced lockdowns, very vastly different responses. So my question is, how do you respond as a chaplain to a community when across the road from one another people can be in very different spaces on that graph?
Yeah. We respond to individuals. You meet the needs of each individual person you meet, recognizing that as a whole of community, that top graph is happening. The whole community is very early on heroic. We're going to get through this. And as they do that stock take, the whole of the community becomes disillusioned. Where are we now in pandemic? We're probably heading down towards that bottom spike there somewhere, bouncing around at the bottom. And we're 18 months in, and so we're just now sort of at the beginning of that disillusionment stage where people are rebelling. They're not wanting to comply. They're having demonstrations to try to find a different way. They're unhappy. But each person is individual, and you can't actually tell what's happening for an individual, whether or not, using floods as an example, their house was flooded. In ministry, in disaster recovery ministry, you go to the house that was flooded and you speak to the person there that and they think they're going to be okay. You can tell that they've got a plan for recovery, they're taking their breaks, and quite appropriate. You go to the very next house on the street, on the hill, they didn't have any floodwater in, and you found a person who is so distressed and afraid to come out of their house because they don't know if it's safe yet. I don't know if the water's gone all the way down. I haven't had shoppings for days because I'm afraid to go down the street. And get in the way. And so you might, in the house that's not been damaged by flood, find quite a distressed person because of previous trauma. And we all carry with us trauma that stacks on top of each other during these disasters. And so you meet the individual needs of the person that you're ministering to, at the same time watching what's happening in the whole of the community and trying to find a corporate response as the whole of the church.
I had a question for you, Linda.
Sure.
I have read research before around this idea of collective trauma, a disaster trauma, which occurs not when there's been a natural disaster, but when there's been a disaster caused, a human-made disaster, so a corporation spills some oil or destroys something, and the collective trauma that happens in a community, one of the symptoms of that after a human-caused disaster is a lack of trust or distrust in institutions, and that will be one of the collective symptoms that the community. So I'm just wondering, from your experiences, how does the church find a foothold in a place where that might be happening? It's not a natural disaster, it's been caused by an institutional problem, evil, if you like. Do you have any insights into that?
Oddly enough, in a community, the local church has been there. Our church in St. Stephen's in Toowoomba has been there 160 years. And you actually have quite a bit of credibility when you've been there that long and are still doing and perceived as a solid, a foundation in the community. That actually goes a long ways towards countering the distrust that happens. And you are correct. After a man-made accident, a terrorist attack or things like that, people don't trust anyone. But they will trust you because you've been there the whole time. And so the local church is actually in a very unique position because they see that you've suffered along with them, you've survived this, and you have a particular skill, again, to respond to each person individually. And that's really key, is that you listen to each person and validate them as a human being, and they will be able to overcome the trauma much more quickly than they would if they continue to struggle or feel like they're alone.
Thank you, Linda. I found it really fascinating. You're talking about the two main theologies we're working with is Theodicy and Theophany. I hadn't thought about that before. I just kind of assumed that when we're in trauma that we were just continually almost stuck in that questioning of why. And it got me reflecting on my own experiences of trauma and theophany. How do you help a community hold those two things while they're still asking why, going through the stage of disillusionment and trying to reconcile, but we did see God there?
Yeah, early on, it's individuals. Early on, you hear more theophanies than theodicies. People are too busy, they are too in shock to ask those questions. They are still low on Maslow's needs. They need security, they need food, water, safety, those kind of things. So they don't actually think about theodicy. They don't begin to wrestle with God. But wow, do they recognize when God was there in those moments. And it's much harder as a responder to balance those and hold those things in tension, because you're going from one person to another and you're hearing these amazing stories when people's houses are washed away or burnt down, and yet you still hear the story of how God got us out just in the nick of time, and our lives were saved. And so, you don't have to hold that intention until about 6 months on, when the disillusionment happens. But then you've collected all those stories of theophany, haven't you? And you ask people to retell those stories and those experiences of God when they're at their lowest. And it helps them hold it in tension. You have to hold yourself together.
Well, Linda, let me extend our thanks once again. I think you've given us all so much to think about and to chew on. I've had this conversation with you, and I said at our first lecture that certainly the aim is to work towards a publication of our first 2 years series of lectures. So I look forward to working with you more on this paper, and I know that it will be a great resource for the life of the Synod and the life of the Church, and maybe even, if, as David suggests, a workshop to come. So thank you very much. Let's thank Linda.
Thank you. Thank you.
And thank you each for coming this evening. I don't know what this says about me, but something like this gets me so excited. It makes me so happy when the church, when we gather together to create space, to ask good questions and to wrestle with God and each other and what it means for us to be doing public theology in the spaces we inhabit in our ministry here in Queensland. So I'm so grateful that we're beginning this journey together, and very much looking forward to our next lecture, which is on the 18th of November. The Reverend Dr. Peter Hobson will be delivering that lecture, and the title of the lecture, which I'm sure will get a lot of you excited, is The Basis for Continuing. So it's going to be a provocative evening for us to really think about what is the basis for us continuing in union in the Uniting Church in Australia. So I hope you can be there. You can register already, and we certainly hope the mood of our current times, we certainly hope it is happening as a public event on the 18th of November, and we're thrilled to look forward to that. So thank you, Peter, for being willing to do that. So good night to all. It's been a wonderful evening, and hope to see you then.